Good afternoon. Welcome again to the second session of today. We have the honor to have with us Juan Suárez de Vivero, who's honorary chair of Human Geography at the Faculty of History of this university, and he's one of the biggest specialists in marine governance. So he's the perfect speaker to open the conference with an opening conference, and he's going to be introduced by Juan Carlos Rodríguez Mateos, who's also a professor at this faculty and the head of the Department of Human Geography, and one of the big collaborators of Juan Luis López de Vivero. They have worked together in big projects for the European Union on maritime governance. They have a paper from 2023 who's entitled Facing New Challenges in Ocean Governance.
It's something I haven't mentioned yet, but tomorrow, privately, in our academic session in the morning, something that we're doing is an author's workshop. I mean, getting together some authors and debating on our next papers to be published in the same magazine. So it's a way to link Professor Suárez's presentation and DEEPMED, it's through Juan Carlos' presentation, so I'm really grateful for that.
Hola, buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon to everybody. Before further ado, I want to thank Professor Camprubí for his invitation today. I believe that it's really interesting sometimes for different colleagues and experts from different sectors, perspectives, to get together to share their experiences. For example, oceanographers, humanists, specialists in international law, geographers, I believe, etc. So it's really grateful to have such a gathering. So again, congratulations to the organizers, and thank you again for having invited me. I believe it's quite interesting because even though Professor Juárez de Vivero and I have been collaborating since the 90s, working together, I mean, since the 90s, it's the first time I introduced him. I've attended many of his conferences. We've exchanged plenty of times, but it's the very first time I introduced him. It's quite funny. So the speaker, as Professor Camprubí said, is a specialist on sea geography. I believe this is how we like our speciality to be called. It's even though we deal with water on sea policies and the spatial analysis and other management tools, some other fields of work has been the study or the management of the alternative fisheries management techniques. We've also been working since the 90s till up to the first half of the 21st century. We have worked on fisheries management. We've published several chapters in different books and papers. Also the maritime geopolitics. This is the core, the fundamental topic of what we're working on at the moment. It has a similar title of Lino's title. Ours is Deep Rest, not DEEPMED. We have certain links that could be established between our project and DEEPMED. Ours focuses on analyzing which could be the environmental consequences that could derive from the exploitation of the bottoms of the sea, far beyond the ocean commons. Professor Suárez will be telling us about all of this. What happens in this patrimony of the humanity? What will happen in the future on these seabeds if this exploitation goes on and on? What could be the consequences? And of course, what could be also the consequences from the geopolitical perspective? What sort of conflicts could derive from this exploitation of these areas far beyond the national jurisdiction, the ocean commons? This adds up to the fragmentation that happens in this world common ocean, given the different maritime borders and the reivindication from different nationalities or nations, rather. And again, the problem that also derives from what it could be used or how we would use these areas far beyond the national jurisdictions. It's rather than the evolution, the synthesis or the brief work by my colleague, dear fellow professor, and some other researchers. Again, we need to put this into context, given the recent evolution of the sea or the ocean's geography, which is a branch within the human geography. I remember in a congress someone was telling me that the geography of the seas and the oceans is not actual geography. It's true that mankind, that human beings don't live in the seas, but we use it as trade lines, trade spaces. It's a source of products and food and minerals and raw materials, and again, it's a source of human conflict. So undoubtedly, this justifies a humanistic analysis and again the science of geography. So it's absurd to say that the geography of the oceans doesn't fall within the big domain of the geographical studies. So we have given you a few details on the context. Now I shall give the floor to Professor Suárez, which surely will be more interesting about the epistemological aspects of our studies. Professor Suárez will shed some light on some topics that were not really studied and analyzed, all these ocean commons, and he will tell us about what's being done internationally from the juridical or legislative framework to protect such areas far beyond national jurisdictions, and also the territorial consequences that could derive from the application of international law on the law of the sea. Surely there will be some other experts that will be able to give us more information on this topic. We have been working on this during these last years. The title of our presentation is Marine Areas Far Beyond the National Jurisdiction from the International Relationships and Geopolitics Perspective. So without further ado, Professor Suárez, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Juan Carlos, for your kind presentation. Thank you, Professor Camprubí, for his kind invitation to participate in the presentation of this project. Right. The main goal of my presentation today is to tell you a little bit more about the relevance that is acquiring the maritime areas beyond the national jurisdictions from both the international relationships and the geopolitics perspectives regarding the ocean's governance. Lately, we have observed a greater interest and a shift towards the high seas and the seabed, when before the focus was on the spaces where the exclusive economic area and the high sea for in each nation. But this shift on the areas far beyond the ocean commons have to do with the economic expectations linked previously to the minerals found on the seabeds and currently to a new possibility with a potential almost amazing potential to change and modify all our preconceived ideas on these spaces. And also it's worth mentioning that the idea on these spaces that we have to do with the fact that we are managing to build a new tool to protect, conserve, and apply a sustainable use of such spaces. So my intervention will delve on maritime governance firstly, and afterwards I'll focus on some geographical areas so that we can ascribe such phenomena to a specific area. And in order to do so, I shall begin by mentioning these two premises. One of them is this geopolitical shift, consisting in the transformation of the territorial base by the states as a consequence of the space where they can exert this jurisdiction, being a maritime space. In most of the coastal states or nations, the territorial base has to do with it's of a maritime nature, let's say, and this has all sorts of consequences, and they're crucial ones. Also, my argument is sustained on something that international law experts and geopolitics experts talk about. It's the international law as an ideal, as a normative ideal, a decline of this idea. So it's the order based on rules. This starts happening after the Second World War. And in this case, I included because I believe that this has to do with what's happening with the common human patrimony, the seabed, far beyond national jurisdictions. And as a general overview, as I mentioned, again, this shift or this change towards the high seas and the area being common goods, as a consequence of the interests these areas are gaining, soon we will need to define the geography of these spaces in a much accurate way. The chart that you can see here on this slide illustrates this idea. In this cartography, what we could see, what's been highlighted, is how each nation projects their sovereignty, their jurisdictional areas, but we see some non-defined wide areas. These are the ocean commons, and they now acquire this, they gain this information in general interest. So, having mentioned my premises, now I would like to mention 3 aspects which I consider to be interesting. One, having to do with the international frameworks and agreements and the relationship established between states and the sea, what I call the geopolitical segmentation. And to do so, I use this chart or table where you can see these different aspects which have the governance and the territorial aspects as the 2 main pillars. And we can also mention some tendencies, on the one hand, towards the reinforcing maritime nationalism, which on its own is linked with the erosion of multilateralism, and on the other, this geopolitical shift affecting not only states and their territorial base, but also these areas beyond national jurisdictions. As for the principles, I'd like to mention how some key issues like the common human patrimony is being redefined. It was established in the 70s, shortly before the 3rd UN conference took place on the law of the sea in 1973 up to 1982. I'm not sure whether I'm giving you too much information, because I don't know how much information, whether you're really acquainted with it or not, but I would like to carry on with some more info. Another aspect which is worth analyzing or mentioning is the erosion of this common human patrimony, which now it's been put on the table while negotiating the creation of this tool. I will tell you, it's the sustainable use and conservation of the maritime or marine biodiversity. International agreements. This treaty on the sustainable use and protection of biodiversity is part or is under the umbrella of the convention we have. It's a UN clause, the acronym, the English acronym, and you can see this instrument. Please give me a second to change the slide. Here we go. For those of you interested on this instrument being now on undergoing a negotiation phase, we can find it as these internationally binding legal instrument. It's only binding only for the undersigning states. Usually we also find it under this other denomination, which is the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And we don't have yet, we haven't coined an acronym in Spanish, because the whole title is what can be read here. It's a very long title, so the most common are ILBI or the high, also we call it the High Sea Treaty. It's how media usually use it or name it. I don't truly agree with it because it's quite unprecise. As you can see here in the long, complete title, this instrument has to do with areas beyond national jurisdictions. there are the high seas, but also the seabed. So, and this is not innocent in the sense that it also includes the underground underneath the seabed. So these principles affecting the high seas should also affect their seabed, but this is not always the case. And this point linked to this instrument, which was the first session actually took place around 20 years ago in 2018, and it hasn't happened up to March 2023, where we have agreed on a first draft of the text. We will invite states to ratify it, to sign it, and when we reach 60 states having ratified it, it will be a reality. We may need to wait 15 more years. It will surely come into force soon. Also, the collision amongst existing institutions within the convention regarding seabed, it's the international institution, as we can see it in its English, the ISA, and also the relationship between the collision between the institutions, as we will see, that fall within the ILBI, together with some of the regional institutions in charge of managing some other different uses and activities. It's being debated, and some people worry about it because they don't truly know what's gonna be the final outcome, this competition amongst institutions.
And then there's another key aspect on which I will be giving you a few details, which is this change or translation of big interests from mineral resources to marine genetic resources or gene resources. With regards states and the sea, I will be lunging on the subject later on. There's another issue which I believe is worth mentioning, and it is this proliferation, this abundance of types of states which are included within the umbrella or underneath the umbrella of these tools, these instruments. And with regards to principles, in order to be fast, what is creating the biggest concern is the current discussion on how marine gene resources should be regulated. So far, the tool available for the management of resources in the bottoms of the sea and the underground are the ones within mentioned by part 11 of the convention, by applying the principle of paying it a common heritage of humanity. What is executed is an ascription or a sharing of benefits stemming from mining in order to improve the situation of developing countries. All right, this instrument or this way of managing mineral resources of the depths of the sea was confronted with a great deal of contestation. In fact, the US, which was the country which more sternly rejected this principle, has not yet ratified this convention. And the thing now would be to apply this measure to marine gene resources, genetic resources, because when the convention was approved, the possibility was not yet been discovered, was not out there. So right now there are, so to say, two ways to approach these. The people who believe that marine genetic resources should be dealt with within the principle of something located in the high seas, or on the other side, as something belonging to the freedom of research in marine areas. And then there are others who still maintain that the principle of a common heritage of humanity should also cover the exploitation of genetic resources. As a consequence of all these, the first come, first served system would be implemented. And it is the principle which covers this mechanism. Of course, there's quite a deal of discussion on this issue, and there's quite an abundant literature that you can resort to in the internet. And why is it that marine genetic resources are so important? This possibility, or this new field, has got a very disruptive effect, because it can lead to consequences which would nullify many of these initiatives. And among marine genetic resources, there's also the genetic edition digital information issue. And the concept of genetic resources was defined in this tool, in this instrument, which is already taking the form of a draft. And Article 111 explains that all marine genetic resources are all types of material which contains functional units of the inheritance having a potential real value, and it is seen to contribute to the understanding of the molecular base of life and of the evolution and the ways in which genes can be manipulated in order to provide new therapies and treatments for diseases, new sources of energy and other products. And this, of course, opens such a big field that it means it entails evolution, and that doesn't mean that mineral resources are no longer interesting. Of course not. They are still very interesting. And for example, the polymetal nodes, polymetal sulfurs, and the ferromanganese cobalt crusts. And there's another section which is fundamental for us to understand why people are so much concerned about this, and it is the way in which access can be gained. What are these resources about? And among the four access systems, one of them is in situ, another one, a fourth one is the one defined as the computational way. That means, or by prospecting. So we are dealing with nucleic acid sequences studied by digital analysis in order to create innovation, genetically modified organisms. So we are approaching a dimension which has nothing to do with the physical resource itself. And in fact, we're seeing that the physical material is being replaced with digital information, because all this genetic manipulation is already done through databases which are present in the cloud, in the digital cloud. At a certain time, there might have been a sample with an animal or a vegetable origin, but then what people will be working on will be digital information, and this creates a delocation or a transfer of that physical material, a replacement of that physical material with visual information. The practical effect, which is also generating quite a bit of discussion, is that a tool, which is the egalitarian and balanced distribution of profits, which is mentioned at the Convention on Biodiversity and is the subject, one of the subject matters of the Nagoya Protocol, it's very difficult to apply because this information cannot be tracked down after some time. So attributing the benefits to someone would be a very complex task to approach. So that's an area where an intense discussion has been generated in terms of how to solve this issue. I also said that mineral resources are still quite interesting, and behind these ferro manganese crusts linked to ecosystems such as, for example, the hydrothermal sources and underwater volcanoes. That's why some states which have the possibility to enlarge their continental platform, because they're trying to gain access to such ecosystems. So they would already be considered as belonging to the national jurisdiction. The problem with regards the distribution of benefits is that the Nagoya Protocol was intended for it to be applied to space under national jurisdiction. So at the ILBI, we're talking about resources outside national jurisdiction. Okay. Of all these, what we could be drawing is that we are seeing or contemplating a change in the image of the bottoms of the sea from the extraction of resources to digital edition, which would lie in the realm of the economy of knowledge. So we're talking about very different paradigms. Okay, the second aspect I wanted to highlight is got to do with governance and institutions. Here the problem is, from what we can see in scientific literature, and especially with regards to reports by international organizations, people are worried with regards, concerned with the relationship between the authority exerted over the depths of the sea, because, for example, ISA, right after the consensus was reached, issued a report detailing which would be its areas of authorities, its competencies, because this international authority apparently, or in essence, should only be dealing with minerals, so genetic resources would be laying outside the scope of this institution. But then there's a series of regional institutions which are working on different marine resources, because we do not know how the approval of the ELB is going to be implemented. For example, the ELB considers all these institutions. For example, the Conference of the Parties, the technical scientific body, the Committee on Access and Participation on Benefits, so which has got the complicated task ahead of trying to solve the problem. And then there's another aspect, which is the issue of marine protected areas. And one of the reasons why this designation appears here is because it's been linked with the possibility of creating protected marine areas outside national jurisdiction. they did not exist before, but also at the scale of ocean basins. In order to fulfill these objectives promoted by NGOs, for example, the protecting 30% of the ocean by 2030. So in order to create these protected marine areas, this tool envisages a series of procedures. For example, a new mechanism which is voting. So if there's no consensus, a vote can be cast. But in any case, it involves the whole of the international community. So as we will be seeing, there are basins at which creating or reaching that agreement can be also quite complex. And third, this other aspect of states and the sea. I'm interested here on the issue on how these categories, geoeconomic categories, can be proliferating. At the Convention of 1982, there was just one of these categories present, that of disadvantaged or geographically disadvantaged states. And the convention regulated the way in which states have a projection onto the ocean. So if a country doesn't count on a shoreline, it will draw no benefits from the sea. Or if they've got another country blocking their way out onto the sea, they could draw no benefits. And so that's why this definition was created for. But now, during the last few years, all these lengthy categories, list of categories has been appearing. Less developed states without a coastline, developing island states, archipelagic states. And I do not understand why these appears. It's the first time it appears in any international instrument. And the thing is that it is not determined how each of these contexts or these types of territories are going to be benefiting from that which is regulated in the document. So these categories usually appear at in political instruments, and they have been included here. If you have any interest to read these texts, the ILB text, at the very beginning you will be able to read that these types of countries will be taken into account when applying this tool. So in general terms, all these categories of states cover about 70% of the international community, of the member states of the United Nations, even if some of these countries could fall under several categories, and even in some cases, because the sense it's got is that of identifying situations in which an economic disadvantage appears. But disadvantaged countries can also be developed countries. For example, Germany is a geographically disadvantaged country, but of course is not at the level of, for example, a known coastal landlocked state in Africa. So all these, I think, is quite interesting, because there's a kind of a lack of logic between this principle of speaking about a common heritage of mankind, which is being cut down, And then these economic categories, because you get the feeling that because of them being included in the article, they will have the problems solved. And also, as the treaty does not specify, does not explicit how these different categories are developed, it's a bit surprising that they are included. And this also involves a greater deal of fragmentation of international relationships because of the definition of all these categories. This phenomenon was also highlighted throughout the negotiation of the ELB, because when these instruments, when institutions started negotiating these instruments, groups of interests were born, so they could promote, so they could advocate for the subjects they were interested in. So, for example, this proliferation of groups is also mentioned, and the blooming of these groups makes it very difficult to make progress with regards the development of the text. With these, we are analyze aspects having to do with the conceptual framework, and now I'd like to link these to a specific geographical situation, which will be North Atlantic. But first, I would like you to have a look at these diagrams and the legal structure of the ocean as a global entity. In the diagram of the left, you may see the high seas, which are the areas outside national jurisdiction. And also you have the PCE acronym, the extended, which stands for Extended Continental Shelf. And the magnitudes for each of these concepts are more or less in balance. The high seas are seen to be bigger than the zone, but there's still a certain balance. And there's one-third concept, which is that of the Extended Continental Shelf, which is a legal term appearing at the convention and which has not yet been defined. There's a need for each state to make a proposal in terms of the definition of the external rim, the external edge of the platform. So we're talking about countries which have a coastline which is too prolonged and it would go beyond the shelf. So those that area of economics interest, exclusive area of economic interest, is at the expense of reducing of the size of the zone. And on the other hand, on the diagram on the right hand side, you may see the relationship between the areas and national jurisdiction and areas outside national jurisdiction. And there are more or less, they are distributed in around about 50%. And that means that all states, all countries, all areas under national jurisdiction are regulated with the rules of the countries with a coastline. And what is in red should be regulated with the rules of the international law. And also with the participation of all states, which are the political actors which have a say on all areas falling outside national jurisdiction. And this gives you an idea of the complexity of the marine governance. Both in areas under national jurisdiction, we'll look into that now, because there are some countries which are not, which can deal with the governance of such spaces, but also they are actors of the international community and should have the capacity to work in this respect. And now we enter into the geographical definition. We saw at the beginning everything that was wide and undefined space, because that undefined space is created in terms of exclusion. So both the high seas and the zone, which is the legal term covering the depths and the underground and the water outside national jurisdiction, would be everything which is not falling under an exclusive economic zone or continental shelf. And all that is got a geographical structure. And that is a part of what we are looking into at this project referred to by Juan Carlos, and within this project, which deals with 4 zones in different oceans, in the Pacific, the Atlantic, and in that green box, that's an area where IFREMER, which is the French Ocean Institute, is going to do field work, and that is a part of the Mid-Atlantic Reach. And on yellow in the map, you have everything which is under national jurisdiction. You have the exclusive economic area, which would cover the first line with the 200 miles arches, and then you have the limit of the extended continental shelf, delimited by Canada in this case, but with the peculiarity that also on top of this yellow band there's a column on water which corresponds to high seas. So in order to gain access to space under national jurisdiction, you've got to do that through a free space. And that's what you may see there. The area with lines is the high seas column, which is lying on the extended continental shelf. That is what is beyond the 200 miles. And that also means or entails a certain great deal of complexity. There's a specialist on international law, Professor Tullio Scolacci, who has used the terminology of the Convention on Fisheries, identifying a term such as the straggling stocks, that is, the populations which are shouldered among different exclusive economic zones. So we're talking about financial resources which are bridging the exclusive economic area and the high seas, and that increases the complexity of the issue of the egalitarian distribution of benefits. Okay, so now we may see what the area of coverage of the free zone and then high seas. So high seas, as part of the high seas, lie on the continental shelf. Its extension is bigger, is broader. So, well, we're talking about two spaces which can be defined in morphological terms. So we're talking about a geography of areas laying outside the national jurisdiction, as there's a geography of spaces under national jurisdiction, exclusive economic areas, etc. So in these boxes corresponding the areas of study for the project, we have the contracts managed by the marine, the authority for the control of the seabed, which is only dealing with exploration contracts and not exploitation contracts. Each of those contracts is endorsed by a sponsoring country, and in this case, the areas where contracts are available correspond to the government of Poland, the Russian government, and a public French institution, which is the IFREMA, which I mentioned before. The diagram shows you the dimensions of each of these jurisdictional concepts. You have the basin in orange, high seas, which is still a wide area in North Atlantic, the zone, the exclusive economic zone, which reaches up to almost half of the basin. So depending on the geographical area, the parameters will vary. The exclusive economic areas, which are smaller than the addition of the whole of the zone, and the continental shelf, the extended continental shelf. Now I would like to call your attention on a comparison for you to see how, depending on the water basin, the lines, the limits vary. There's a map, of course, of the Mediterranean, which is the environment to which the DEEPMED project is ascribed. Also because the Mediterranean has got some peculiarities. First, in terms of geography, there's no place, no distance longer than 400 miles. So if an exclusive economic zone is created either by a northern or southern country, that the areas will be overlapping. So a common border should be defined. So in the Mediterranean, not all countries have claimed or made a claim for an exclusive economic zone. There's a part in the high seas, and this is circumstantial because states still pending can still make a claim for it, would mean about a fourth of the whole of the Mediterranean basin being in the high seas. So there, once the ELB is approved as an instrument, it would be of application. But it could not be done with regards to the seabed. Why? Because the convention, one of the requirements of the conventions is that there should be a law claiming the exclusive economic zone, and the extension of the territory is anyway acknowledged to enjoy a series of jurisdictional rights. So all the seabeds are in the Mediterranean, all areas in the seabed are under some or other jurisdiction. You may see there the size of the basin. We're talking about 2.5 million square kilometers. The high seas, which is now about 25%. The exclusive economic zones, which are the ones that so far have been claimed by the countries. And then you have the continental shelf, the yellow bar, which is the whole. So the continental shelf covers as an area which is equal to that of the basin. And this situation affects Spain, for example, in the Alboran Sea, because the exclusive economic zone of Spain was only created starting from the Gata Cape. So you have high seas close to the territorial seas, but what's underneath the seabed and the underground is a continental shelf which is not yet been delimited. So we would be talking about equal distance seas as the main principles ruling right now. And with regards to the other basins, the Baltic and the Black Sea, because of the geographic characteristics, there's no high seas. So everything is under the jurisdiction of countries following the concept of an exclusive economic zone. So this new treaty would not be of application here. And a third example which is that of the Arctic, is an ocean, but enjoys characteristics which are similar to those of the regional basins. So the Arctic Ocean, as we all know, it's a very complex basin from the environmental point of view. Of course, people are quite concerned because the speed at which the ice is melting is taking everyone by surprise. And also there are not many countries, not many coastal states surrounding the sea. And if you take the Arctic polar cycle as a limit, it's just 5, but 6 if you follow the principles of the International Hydrological Organization. In any case, a very small number of countries. But coastal states, which are partly big countries such as Canada, the US, or the Russian Federation, because of the extension of the coastline, they have the capacity to project their sovereignty. So the area which would be free would be a very small one. So the blue zone you can see in the diagram is almost symbolic. There's a bit more of high seas, but a great deal of the basin is under national jurisdiction, be it under the concept of exclusive continental zone or extended shelf. So the Russian Federation, when they submitted the limitation of the continental shelf beyond the 200 miles, it included the North Pole, and they placed a flag at that point. So all this leads to a series of behaviors which exert quite a bit, quite a level, a big deal of maritime nationalism. At the section entitled Neighboring States, there's quite a bit of text in the treaty because it regulates, or it also includes that neighboring states should be checked with when assuming some measures. And this situation of neighboring states will be very different depending on the basin. Here at this part of the Atlantic coastline, we have some 26 states plus a territory which is being decolonized, such as the Western Sahara. And for you to have some information on the complexity of this situation, there you are, the length of the borders generated out of the application of the concept of the exclusive economic zone, about 29,000 kilometers, which is reflecting which appears in blue with the light blue lines in the map, and some 24,000 kilometers of lines of borders in the economic, with regards to economic exclusive economic zone. So every single aspect should be dealt with in the treaty, within the framework of the treaty. There you have a typology in terms of the maritime territory of these states. On the one side, we have these countries generating large jurisdictional environments, for example, Canada or Portugal, which is a spectacular case because almost all its territory is maritime territory. There you have in orange solid land, and then in blue you have the continental shelf and the economic zone. And of these countries, the only one with an emerged territory which is bigger than that of the physical land is Canada. The rest of them, the maritime territory is bigger than the land. For example, Spain has got double its area, and also I've included the value in terms of population because it's a social political index, which should be highlighted considering what you see on the right-hand side, which is the typology of states in the Caribbean. Most of them are small insular states which are still developing.
For example, if we consider the emerged land, being the case of Honduras, Panama, and Belize, in the rest of cases, we see the gray color of the country because then the emerged land has no value, let's say. And this, as a conclusion, means that such island states need to govern on a maritime territory. They're developing countries and they lack the technical and economical capacities. There's some interesting data in the literature which has generated this new instrument. The amount of states which have the capacity to exploit the maritime genetic resources are not more than 10. The countries having the know-how and the technology being capable of obtaining some genetic information is very limited because all these countries, let's remember, not only due to the fact of the maritime genetic resources, have a very limited capacity to govern their own territories. There's another aspect that is pretty interesting. Here we see the sponsoring countries and the ones defending the moratorium. Regarding mining of seabeds, there is a huge worry because there is a certain consensus on the impact of such mining activities. It's not going to be argued or discussed. There are countries in favor of the moratorium because they consider that the ecosystems being affected are not known really well yet. We don't have enough information. So it's debated to establish a moratorium as for the beginning of these mining activities after these huge amount of knowledge has been gained. Spain is one of the countries in favor of this moratorium. And also the sponsoring countries, in this case, there are very few, only these France and two countries, Poland and the Russian Federation, as the IFREMER Institute indicates. And another aspect which I would like to highlight is the capacity by nations to control such maritime territory. Here what I have cartographed is states with maritime policies and plans to order or put into practice some sort of jurisdiction. Here we have some pioneering countries when elaborating some plans to establish all these national jurisdiction both on the continental shelf and the exclusive economic zone. These pioneer countries, the US and Canada, were the first ones, but also the European Union, I believe it's where the new, the most modern plans are being established. After these directives and these legislative management plans have been established, all the countries have needed to introduce or present these management plans. 40% of this basin would be under control either of maritime policies or legislative management tools. And the case of Spain is worth mentioning, because when we apply these directive and this maritime management plan was sent to a higher level so that these tools could be implemented. Our maritime space was divided in 5 different sub-areas. The most important ones being the northwestern demarcations or areas, the western part of the country, Galles, an area, the Balearic Basin, the Canary Islands Basin, and the Alboran Sea. Specifically in blue, you can see the extended area being more than 300,000 square kilometers in the Canary Islands. You can see that in blue in the chart. These areas include the extended continental shelf. However, Spain has communicated that in the plans recently approved that can be downloaded in the Meteco website, the extended continental shelf is not included. The reason for that being that it's pretty complex to limit and establish the borders in such maritime areas. In the northwestern area, this polygon here that I'm indicating, this has to do with a joint proposal between Ireland, the UK, France, and Spain, but it has not been equally divided amongst these 4 countries. And the southern area faces also an issue, a problem with Portugal. In the Canary Islands case, all this area is excluded for obvious reasons. First of all, given the level of conflict in the Western Sahara region, and also due to the need to limit these continental shelf together with Portugal after Madeira, the archipelago in Madeira. Right, conclusions. I've wanted to highlight 4 main conclusions. There are others that I could have included, but I'd rather mention these 4. On the one hand, these shift from the geopolitical focus of the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf to the high sea and the area. This makes sense now, especially given to the fact that the ELB has been put into practice. We don't really know when it will come into force, really. Secondly, as a consequence, let's say, of that change, the previous shift, or this relevance that the areas far beyond national jurisdictions, it will be hence necessary to define a geography of both the high seas and the area. In the same way as the areas under national jurisdiction has been done, we now need to do it also with these new other spaces. Also, we should highlight this disruptive element, this change of what it means, the marine seabeds linked to mineral resources versus seabed with genetic addition and genetic resources. It's a new paradigm, I believe. It's fundamental. And in 4th position, I highlight the problem of these principles that we are seeing being menaced due to the challenge that technological advances mean. This modifies everything that we had regulated before. We have had very expensive and very hard to reach tools like the UN Convention. UN clause, for example, was born in 1973. It was approved in 82, and it came into force in 1993. So we're talking of 2 decades. So genetic modification and all this legislation has done a huge amount of leaps and changes. It's like what's happening with AI, you know, the speed at which these changes are happening and the impossibility to follow at the same pace, the same rhythm, you know. All these advances and things are evolving so rapidly. So the legislation is always behind. So we see the marine genetic resources changing everything, and also the political ideology, the decline of international law as the perfect, allegedly perfect judicial or legal mechanism. It's funny because the day this consensus was reached for this draft of the text, Guterres, the UN General Secretary back then, he said multilateralism has triumphed, and this is still to be seen, but they really wanted to highlight this. Actually, all they had reached was just a draft, so it has not really, this tool didn't come into force, but it's again a sign of the importance it entails and how hard it is for the UN to reach such consensus. Well, this is all from me today, so all I need to say is thank you very much for your attention.
Bueno, agradecemos.
Right, thank you very much, Professor Suárez de Vivero, for your wonderful presentation. I already knew the text, the cartography. However, it's always a great pleasure to listen to his dissertations, his new ideas, and the way he awakens our imagination so that we can always listen to new things when we listen to him. And also I'd like to say I'm really pleased that this conference is covering many geopolitical aspects. It's like closing the loop, you know, going back to the very first ideas of some geographers at the end of the 19th century when they really considered some of strategic or geopolitical perspective back then. And now we are reanalyzing again this same idea, obviously from a different perspective and searching totally different goals. But this comes to prove the interest that comes with maritime geopolitics, the way we analyze the maritime spaces and the international relationships, not always as known as we should, but again, this adds up to other sciences studying the oceans. So it's been a great pleasure for me to listen to him, and I hope it's also been interesting to all of you. I don't know whether you have any comments, queries, whether you'd like to clarify anything. Thank you very much. It's been really amazing, and I truly agree with the fragmentation of the ocean's sovereignty. It's not casual, it's deliberate. What I'd like to ask is the lack of reference regarding the Mediterranean with an existing mechanism, because it's true that this multilateral tool will take plenty of time to come into force. And within this framework, we have created areas beyond national jurisdictions. I mean, the Barcelona text, where we have seen some areas of, in this convention, of areas to be respected, both for the maritime flora and fauna. So I would like to know what's your perspective in this sense. We can't really say that there's a lack of management tools regarding the Mediterranean basin. There are plentiful. However, the issue they face, I believe, is the weakness when it comes to putting them into practice. There's a report I recommend you from Professor Tullio Sclasti and a Tunisian one, examining all these legislative tools in the Mediterranean Sea, and also mentioning the weakness when it comes to putting them into force. It's their weak point, I fear. But yes, in the Mediterranean area, there are myriad of legislative tools, not only in the high seas, but also in transnational spaces, such as this protected area between France and Italy, Pelagos, that's right. Indeed, obviously, we have a great tradition and trajectory as to cooperation tools. The issue is still lays in its efficacy. I mean, the weakness of make them effective. For example, within the Mediterranean Action Plan, a document has approved to create management plans. So at least formally, we can find plenty of documents and tools for the different states. Each state, at the end of the day, needs to activate, to put into force these tools. So this is where we face this lack of effectiveness, unfortunately. Do you have any other questions? Thank you very much, Professor. I would like to pose a question. We can establish a very interesting parallelism between the importance that back then in the 70s and 80s, when we discussed UNCLOS, the UN Convention, the actual importance that the offshore extraction or exploitation of oil, and afterwards the negotiations regarding the maritime mining resources. Now we could talk about the actual importance of finally 50 years afterwards and the future importance that is being assigned to these genetic resources. But right now I believe that this is only a future importance. I would like you thus to clarify a little bit better, first, the specificity of the maritime medium for this genetic and biodiversity richness, and then how can we contemplate right now the valorization from the economic perspective of such biodiversity and resources, because for those listening without plenty of information like me, it seems that we are comparing the mining resources with scientific research. But surely there is an economic value that I can hardly value versus the real value of the mining. And empirically, if this prevalence of these genetic resources is in the documents, or is it just an interpretation of them? Well, the word prevalence, I haven't used it. They are only expectations. And first of all, we would need to differentiate between what's being done under national jurisdiction areas, because mining activities under jurisdictional areas are a reality. They're ongoing. The problem lies beyond those areas. That's where the problem arises, because part of the ocean's commons, has a great entity, and such resources, as I mentioned, the fact that genetic resources are awakening all these expectations, it doesn't imply for the mining resources losing this value. We are doing an awful lot of things already. It's not something regarding the future. Genetic evolution or genetic modification is already happening. There's a major industry which is already obtaining benefits. Can't recall right now one of the reports that has been published after the approval or this consensus or at ILBI. There was a Spanish company being named, which I believe is a pioneer in the genetic addition or modification and accessing to resources based on genetic resources. For example, drugs to battle cancer. Marc Güell is the person, but this doesn't happen without maritime resources. This company is based in Galicia, and it's internationally renowned. The issue is why in the oceans? Because the major biodiversity of the planet is located in the oceans. The oceans occupy 70% of Mother Earth's surface. And what's being debated right now is that a great deal of this diversity is still unknown. The little information we have sheds plenty of information, and the greater of these expectations is that there's still an awful lot for us to discover. This is the amazing potential that awakens everyone's interest. A great deal of the biodiversity on Earth is marine. So this is crucial for the near future. I don't know if you understood or I clarified your question. Thank you. It's been very useful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Juan Luis, for your analysis, because as he mentions, often I can observe these cartographies and, you always add information. So thank you very much for your new analysis. Regarding exploitation of resources, we could see in one of the slides that this zone and these new permits, it's quite interesting, the issue with Poland. And I would like to mention that the states that have not signed the convention, and they are using the high seas right now for the transit of goods or the exploitation, this legislation doesn't affect them. So the fact that this moratorium exists in order to proceed with the studies, valuing, as the colleague said, and could define the biological value for the common goods and the heritage, the fact that countries that have not signed the convention and are currently exploiting these resources, this has consequences for everybody. Do you think that these studies can break this multilateralist and pro-nationalist so that we can protect the common resources? I think this is the more delicate aspect of it all. The US, for example, they have not signed this convention, but they are pioneers when it comes to exploiting genetic resources. The most important companies are also US companies. So this implies an issue when it comes to adopting common causes, because this is the way the mechanism works. Countries not having signed are not obliged. It's only the rest of states exerting some pressure on them that can work. Unfortunately, there's no other mechanism. And it can be worrying indeed. Again, the freedom of maritime research to access to these genetic resources, it's something we can consider, because at the end of the day, we would limit the mechanism and we would gain more equity and equilibrium and justice internationally. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer. I can't foresee how it's all going to evolve. This has to do with international relationships, but there are good reasons to be worried, because these mechanism of first come, first serve mechanism could be a reality. This would be really frustrating for mankind. Do we have another question? I would like to tire you with my questions and my reflections. My question has to do with the maritime space management plans in Spain. When they refer to some island areas, how has the relationship between the regional governments and the Madrid government regarding this plan formulation, and how's the importance of territorialization of these archipelagos defined the way things happen, or has it weighted more the interests of politics? And reflection, all the appropriation of maritime spaces, and what happens with all that we still need to explore regarding energy, for example, with the great maritime currents or the water, the maritime green energy. And again, thank you so much. It's been super interesting. Well, as for the management plans, I can tell you that they have been recently approved. Within the period of drafting, etc., there have been mechanisms to cooperate together with the regional governments, of course. As far as I know, we meant the tidal energies before. The central administration in Madrid has tried to keep distance with regards to the regional authorities, because I believe the predominant sentiment is that the central administration sees this as the last frontier. As I've mentioned before, each regional government should deal with their coastal areas, but Madrid, the central government, has acted with this worry, you know. And also I believe that there has been some lack of interest by the regional authorities. I think it's far too much. They're trying hard to fight and incorporate these competencies. The main problem or conflict I am aware of after the approval of these plans have been the Galician fishermen. But this is a conflict that has happened globally, traditionally. The fisherman interprets when such tools appear that he's losing weight. In the fishing industry, it was always the dominant sector, and now they fear this exclusion. In a certain manner, it's true, but one of the pioneer countries, the US, when they put into practice these management plans, they do so with the goal of promoting the wind energy. So this implied leaving aside some traditional activities which were not generating the benefits, as much benefits as in the past. In Northern Europe, fisheries are less important, and this has not really affected. But here in Spain, in some areas, we see a certain reaction by different municipalities because they fear that if we build all these windmills, this might generate less tourism. But we're not debating this long enough. I don't see much repercussion on the media. I see no social impact, even within the economic sectors, with the exception maybe of the fisheries. And regarding what you mentioned on alternative energies, in this case, they're not delocalized because the wind energy sector lies within the jurisdictional waters due to technological factors, because these windmills should be installed in very not hollow waters. And the administrations should be involved. I don't think any windmills have been installed in maritime areas outside national jurisdiction zones. When I mentioned the maritime current energy, yeah, of course, but this needs a connection with the emerged land. What happens with the windmills? You need them to be wired. They need to be plugged into the main system. So these infrastructures so far are installed nearby emerged land or coastal areas. It's always within 12-mile area, usually. So it could well happen that all this infrastructure is in, I don't know, 200, 250 miles. We will soon see. Any other questions? I think someone would like to mention.
Our project for the DEEPMED project is looking for the third dimension of the sea, which is the Mediterranean Sea, as a part of the
Una tierra helada.
As a part
Y
of the...
esto no va.
Sorry.
Porque creo que hay que buscar el canal.
¿Qué
Este sí
canales?
se oye.
¿Qué canales?
¿El 1?
Vale, ya está.
Se le susurra la oreja.
No. Bueno,
Sí, ese sí se oye.
Se lo conozco. ¿Sí?
Ese sí se oye.
¿Sí? ¿Vuelvo para allá?
Usarlo.
So,
Es que no estaba en el canal con lo que estaba.
okay. Thank you, Professor Vivero, for the presentation. It is a great presentation and interesting information. So, as we are working with the DeepMed project, and a part of project is looking for historical bathymetric data in the Mediterranean Sea, I found that the Mediterranean Sea is, according to the Hydrographic International Organization, only the half, 50% of the Mediterranean Sea is mapped with a good resolution. As you know, Mediterranean Sea is a small sea, only 1% of the world surface, ocean and seas, and it is the most studied ocean in the world. So, in your opinion, is there any relation between jurisdictions and bathymetric data discovery?
Bueno, realmente.
Well, when you mention the mapping or the cartography that has already been elaborated in the Mediterranean Sea, it's indeed a part that is really detailed regarding navigation, shipping, you know. We have great nautical charts throughout the Mediterranean Sea. The level of precision can change in some areas far beyond the coast. It's less precise, but I believe that when it comes to traveling in the sea, the bathymetric data is accurate. As for the relationship with jurisdictions, in some cases there's no such relationship because the procedure is whatever distance to the coast or from the coast, so bathymetry doesn't come into place. The space where sovereignty occurs is defined by a distance, and the convention establishes as a maximum of 12 miles. The exclusive economic zone is 200 miles, and cartography doesn't come into place. The only limitation where the knowledge of the seabed, where it's really precise, is to establish the external limit of the continental margin. In this case, yes, because the convention, the continental marge, because we require knowing the thickness of sediments. In such cases, some campaigns are launched to present this report that the limits that the UN defines are introduced. But generally, at the beginning, yes, there was a will of establishing the continental shelf by the subhabitat limit of 200 meters, but this didn't really work. Really, a certain fixed distance of 200 miles was adopted. And then the straight line base rule, yeah, it considers the profundity, the seabed, but given the norms of the convention, they are not linked with bathymetry, but with the morphology of coastal areas. I don't know whether I answered to your questions.
According to the Hydrographic International Organization, the bathymetric resolution of the Mediterranean Sea is only the half Mediterranean Sea is mapped. How can you explain this information?
Given the fact that we do know it well, because every day we would love to, we see plenty of shipwrecks, etc., given mistakes of maritime cartography. All bathymetry, you all need to do is to get the nautical chart and see the level of detail. There are areas where bathymetry for navigation is not important anymore, except specific exceptions, because a ship could have could be a big 18-meter-long vessel, but when it comes to profundity of hundreds of meters, bathymetry is not important. But there's also another source of information, which are the fishing or fisheries charts, where we see a higher level of precision of the ocean seabed. I don't really know these reports of the International Hydrographic Association, but I'm true that navigation is secure, is safe, and this implies that charts are precise. If it weren't the case, every single day we would see an accident and shipwreck. Maybe there is a rock that has not been identified and there is a ship losing part of the engine, but this is not very common. As for that sort of usage, for other purposes, it is true that bathymetry lacks a degree of precision that is required by other activities. But I see that all this, it depends on for which usage, for which purpose you need this information. For navigation, of course, this information is precise and available. Right, thank you very much, Professor, for telling us all about the high seas treaty, the ILBI. This is the way we knew or had heard about this tool. I agree with the fact that it is a convention, a project, which is really hard to put into place, but it's also true that when we manage the draft, we saw some weak or weaker countries whose voice had not been heard during the Montego Convention, and however, this time we did listen to them. So in this sense, according to Gutierrez, the UN General Secretary, as for multilateralism, I think, yes, it was observed, and a certain worry by the global south was heard, you know, these small island countries. What's your view on this? And also a reflection on the importance of this for Spain and the little information we've heard beyond a certain small groups of experts like us. I believe this is a topic that is unknown even by seamen or people working in the sea industries. I was talking to some colleagues and they had never heard of it. If you read the documents and the briefings of these negotiation sessions, we can see some desperation by the president of such sessions regarding the proliferation of such groups. At a certain moment in time, these reports have allowed a certain difficulty to reach agreements, given this excessive fragmentation of groups, because each group then presents their proposals, writings, etc. So it's difficult to include everyone's opinions, and of course all states learn from other states' experiences, and they are aware of the cost that would imply if they don't exert pressure when some topics that they interest, if they don't pressure other countries. And the UN, yes, it's true, there's an excessive groups of negotiation groups, and this has become an obstacle. It's true. It's true, yes.